The press called it a routine audience. But those who knew the palace rhythm sensed otherwise. King Charles III stood by the tall Georgian window of his private study in Buckingham Palace, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the overcast London skyline. Rishi Sunak was 10 minutes late, not uncommon for a prime minister, but enough to send a message. When the door finally opened, Charles turned slowly, offering a courteous but unreadable expression. "Prime Minister," he said. Sunak entered briskly, coat folded over his arm, no aids, no fanfare. "Your Majesty," he replied, with a tone that landed halfway between protocol and impatience. They sat opposite each other, a modest oak table between them. Tea had been poured, untouched. The discussion began with budget updates, foreign affairs, education reforms, boxes to tick, words to say. But it was when Charles raised the topic of the mounting protests outside Parliament, workers striking, families struggling, veterans left behind, that the air shifted. "The people feel unheard," Charles said. "They look to their leaders, some elected, some not, for guidance." Sunak gave a tight-lipped smile. "And they have their elected leadership. That's why the crown must remain neutral." Charles tilted his head slightly. "Neutrality, Prime Minister, is not silence." Sunak's eyes narrowed. "With respect, Your Majesty, there's a difference between observation and interference. The monarchy's strength lies in staying above the fray." Charles leaned forward, his voice calm, but sharper. "And your strength, Mr. Sunak, lies in knowing which way the wind blows. Mine lies in knowing who stands in it." A brief silence. Outside the window, Big Ben chimed 4 times, loud, clear, unavoidable. Inside, a line had been drawn. By the next morning, word had already begun to seep into Westminster. Nothing official, just whispers in corridors, the kind of murmurs that traveled faster than any press release. Something had shifted between the king and the prime minister. And though no cameras had been present, those close to the scene described the atmosphere as frosted glass, clear enough to see the outlines, impossible to ignore. At Downing Street, Sunak's aides urged discretion. "Let it pass," one whispered. "The palace doesn't escalate." But Sunak, despite his polished exterior, had never liked being challenged, especially not by someone the Constitution described as ceremonial. "He forgets who holds the real reins," Sunak muttered under his breath during a private strategy meeting. But at Buckingham, Charles wasn't interested in court games. That evening, during a reception for veterans of the Commonwealth, the King's remarks took a tone sharper than usual. "We honor service," Charles began, raising a glass to the room. "Not only in uniform, but in sacrifice. In listening. In standing still when the wind demands you lean." To the public, it was poetry. But to those who had heard the Prime Minister's recent phrasing, about neutrality, about staying above the fray, it was unmistakable. Charles had spoken. The tabloids danced around it. The Mirror posed, "Is the Crown speaking louder?" while the Telegraph labeled it a literary coincidence. But online, the clips went viral. TikTok flooded with side-by-side comparisons of Charles's speech and Sunak's soundbites. On X, users tagged posts with #Winds of Buckingham. Sunak felt the pressure. The monarchy wasn't tweeting, but it didn't need to. Its silence had turned into sound. And Charles, whether by intention or instinct, had done what no elected official could, spoken to the soul of a restless public. A storm was building. 2 days later, as Sunak strode out of number 10 toward his waiting car, a protester's voice cut through the drizzle. "Stop hiding behind neutrality." The man held up a placard with a crude drawing, the Prime Minister clutching a briefcase while a paper crown blew away in the wind. A growing crowd had begun to gather outside the gates, and for the first time in weeks, they weren't shouting about tax hikes or rail strikes, they were shouting about leadership. Inside the palace, Charles had taken note, not through social media, but from his staff, his correspondence, and the tone of the nation. Thousands of handwritten letters had arrived, many from families who hadn't written to the monarchy in years. One stood out. A schoolteacher from Leeds had written, "We don't need the crown to pick a side. We need it to remind us we're still worth one." Charles placed the letter gently on his desk. That afternoon, he summoned his private secretary. "No direct statements," he said firmly, "but make sure the veteran speech reaches every military family association in the country." Full text. It was subtle. It was royal. But it was not silent. Meanwhile, inside Parliament, Sunak faced rising murmurs from his own backbenchers. "He's playing you," one warned. "You lecture inflation while he reads poetry and wins hearts." Sunak snapped, "He's a figurehead. I lead the country." But deep down, he knew. In a time of crisis, people didn't always look to power, they looked to presence. And Charles, in his own restrained way, had become very present. That night, the BBC aired a panel discussion titled, "Is the King saying what the PM can't?" It was no longer just about a comment behind palace walls. The quiet contrast had become a national conversation. The wind was no longer blowing. It was swirling. The Prime Minister's office announced it discreetly, almost like an afterthought. A state banquet would be held at Windsor Castle for foreign dignitaries visiting the UK to discuss post-Brexit trade. Charles would host. Sunak would attend. It wasn't supposed to be political. But everyone knew it was. Inside the gleaming halls of Windsor, beneath chandeliers and oil portraits of long-dead monarchs, the table was set like a chessboard. Charles sat at the head. Sunak, positioned 3 seats down, wore his signature guarded smile. As the courses flowed, venison, wine, silence, Charles maintained his role, composed, observant. But when the toasts began, he rose with a glass in hand and a gaze that swept the room like a lighthouse. "In times of transition," he said, "it is not the loudest who guide a people, but those who still remember how to listen." The French minister leaned toward the German ambassador. "He's not just speaking to us." Sunak, glass halfway to his lips, didn't blink. But his fingers tightened slightly. He would not respond here, not in front of cameras and crown. After the banquet, in the ornate antechamber, Charles and Sunak stood alone for a moment. The marble room echoed with a silence weightier than any speech. "You used to admire the old ways," Charles said calmly. "Now you treat tradition like a leash." Sunak met his eyes. "I respect tradition, Your Majesty. But I don't govern by it." Charles offered a faint smile. "No. You govern by calculation. And Britain knows the difference." The moment ended as aides approached, chatter resumed, and protocol swept them apart again. But for those watching, the press, the public, the diplomats, it was clear, the monarchy had shifted its weight on the board. Not to seize power, but to remind the players it still had a presence. It began with a single document, scanned, watermarked, and quietly passed to a freelance journalist known for publishing what others wouldn't touch. The headline dropped like a thunderclap. "King's Concerns, Private Memo Challenges Government's Handling of Crisis." The letter, dated 3 weeks prior, was addressed from the King's private secretary to the Cabinet Office. Polite, meticulously worded, but unmistakable in tone. It urged the government to consider the deep emotional toll of economic instability and reconnect policy with the lived reality of the people. Though Charles hadn't penned it directly, the signature at the bottom read, "By direction of His Majesty." Sunak was furious. "This is an ambush," he told his advisers. "He's overstepping." Again. But when asked if the letter was unauthorized, Buckingham Palace released a 2-line statement. "His Majesty is routinely briefed on matters of national concern. The Crown remains committed to reflection, not direction." It wasn't a denial. It was a mirror. Within hours, the internet erupted. Some praised Charles for finally saying what the public feels. Others accused him of undermining democracy. But for once, both sides were talking about the same thing, and not about inflation, or immigration, or interest rates. They were talking about the king. Inside the palace, Charles remained composed. He didn't retreat. He didn't explain. He simply continued with his duties, visiting a hospice in Liverpool, opening a youth centre in Birmingham, shaking hands, listening deeply. He walks slower than any prime minister, a young nurse tweeted after meeting him. But somehow, he hears more. That night, in a late parliamentary session, one MP stood and said, "Maybe we're not angry at the king for speaking. Maybe we're angry because he's right." A new question had entered the national bloodstream, not just what is the role of a monarch, but what happens when that monarch fills a silence others left behind. The Sunday polls rattled more than expected. Though King Charles held no political power, a surprising 62% of the public now viewed him as the nation's most trusted public figure. Not Sunak. Not the opposition. The Crown. The headlines followed quickly. The silent statesman. Crown popularity surges amid political drift. Britain listens when Charles speaks. For the palace, the uptick was not entirely welcome. Charles had never sought to become a cultural counterweight to the government. His mission had always been steadiness, not stardom. Yet something was shifting, and fast. Behind closed doors, Sunak convened a late-night meeting with his press secretary and senior ministers. "He's not playing politics," one advisor said cautiously. "He's filling a void you left." Sunak slammed the table. "Then I'll fill it myself." The following morning, he announced a public tour across the UK, Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, designed to listen to the people. But when he arrived at the first town hall in Salford, the reception was lukewarm. Only a few hundred turned up. Banners read, "We need leadership, not optics." "He listens." "Do you?" A BBC journalist whispered into her mic. "It appears the Prime Minister is chasing a presence already felt." Meanwhile, Charles continued without spectacle. In Cornwall, he met with flood victims. In Birmingham, he laid a wreath for a nurse killed in service. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words moved. "He's doing what elected leaders aren't," a community organizer said. "He's walking with us." The contrast was becoming more than symbolic. It was structural. And every day that passed without a recalibration from Sunak only deepened the divide. One columnist wrote, "Charles isn't breaking the rules. He's reminding us why they matter." It wasn't just a royal resurgence, it was a reckoning. Parliament was tense, thick with whispers and glances that lingered too long. Officially, nothing had changed. No declarations, no constitutional breaches. Yet beneath the polished speeches and stiff collars, the air was electric. In the Commons, one MP muttered, "We're not fighting Labour anymore. We're fighting a ghost with a crown." Sunak, increasingly irritable, addressed the press directly, "The monarchy is vital, but must remain above the political current. I respect that boundary." It was a veiled jab, and everyone knew where it was aimed. That same evening, Charles hosted a roundtable at Clarence House, not with politicians or aristocrats, but with headteachers, paramedics, and postal workers. The palace didn't publicize it. But someone filmed it on their phone. Just a 19-second clip. Charles, leaning forward slightly, said, "When those with power stop listening, sometimes those with memory must speak." The clip went viral overnight. #MemoryMustSpeak trended for 2 days. At number 10, Sunak snapped at his communications team. "Why is he the one people trust? He doesn't carry the burden of policy. But he carries the trust," an aide replied quietly. The divide was now philosophical. Sunak represented strategy, budgets, international deals. Charles embodied patience, presence, and, perhaps most dangerous of all, moral weight. A leaked memo from a senior Tory strategist called it, "a monarchy-shaped vacuum swallowing public confidence in governance." Meanwhile, Charles didn't alter his rhythm. No angry statements, no interviews. He visited a public housing estate in Sheffield. He sat with a grieving mother who'd lost her son to a knife attack. And again, he listened. "I'm just glad someone looked me in the eyes," she said through tears. In an age of broadcast leadership, Charles had become Britain's quiet echo chamber, reflecting what many felt but couldn't say. And in that silence, a storm was growing. The footage was unexpected, grainy, caught on a bystander's phone outside a charity centre in Leeds. Charles, coat unbuttoned, stepped into the street after an unannounced visit. A man in a high-vis vest approached, hesitant but bold. "You're the first one to show up without a speech ready." Charles paused, then smiled faintly. "That's because I came to hear, not to tell." The clip exploded across platforms. No script. No ceremony. Just a monarch among his people, steady, calm, present. It wasn't supposed to be this way. In Whitehall, Sunak's inner circle was increasingly alarmed. A backbench whisper campaign had begun, murmurs of a leadership challenge, accusations of detachment, questions about whether the Prime Minister had become the least trusted voice in a room full of uncertainty. One minister confessed to a reporter off-record. "Charles isn't running for anything. That's why people believe him." The pressure cooker boiled over when the Times published a front-page headline. "The King and the Vacuum, Who Really Leads?" Sunak was livid. That afternoon, he requested a private audience with the king. When he entered the palace study, Charles didn't rise. He simply gestured to a chair. The silence was longer than polite. "I think we've crossed a line," Sunak finally said. Charles met his gaze. "You mean I've spoken without permission?" "I mean you're undermining confidence." "No," Charles replied quietly. "I'm standing in the space where confidence collapsed." Sunak stood, jaw tight. The crown can't fill every silence. Charles looked back at his papers. "Then speak louder, Prime Minister." The meeting ended without handshake. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, not a storm yet, but building, deliberate. And for the first time in decades, the British people weren't watching politics for answers. They were watching a monarch for clarity. Spring arrived early that year, as if nature itself was eager to move forward. Windsor's gardens bloomed defiantly, petals opening in quiet resistance to political frost. In an unannounced moment, Charles stepped into the palace grounds for a recorded message, something rare, something weightier than tradition usually allowed. No throne. No flags. Just a wooden bench under a budding tree. The video was released on the royal family's official channels, titled simply, "A Reflection." In the 3-minute address, Charles never mentioned Sunak. Never uttered a policy term. Yet the undertones were unmistakable. A nation breathes through its people. It remembers not just through words, but through dignity. In days of noise, restraint is not weakness, it is direction. And in times of uncertainty, the quiet voice of duty must rise. He ended the address with a phrase few had expected from a monarch. "I serve, not to be followed, but to remind." Within an hour, the message was played across news channels, analyzed in opinion columns, and dissected in Parliament. Even opposition MPs, normally hesitant to weigh in on royal matters, praised the tone as "the kind of stability we used to expect from government." Sunak, in a press briefing the next day, attempted to reclaim ground. "Leadership," he said, "requires clarity and discipline, not poetry." But the damage was done. Across Britain, tea-shop radios replayed Charles's words. Schoolchildren wrote essays on quiet leadership. A war veteran interviewed on ITV wiped away a tear. "That wasn't a speech," he said. "That was service." Charles hadn't declared war. He'd declared presence. And for a country battered by crisis and skepticism, it felt like an anchor, gentle, but immovable. For Sunak, the question was no longer how to silence the crown. It was how to keep up with it. It was an engagement scheduled long before tensions flared, a Commonwealth remembrance ceremony at Westminster Abbey. But now, with the weight of weeks behind them, the event felt less like tradition and more like a reckoning. Charles arrived in full ceremonial attire. No excessive pomp, no grand entrance. Just presence, the kind that settled the room with a hush. Sunak stood among the political elite in the front pews, jaw set, arms crossed. As the organ hummed and the prayers began, the two men didn't speak. But when it came time for the king's reading, Charles stepped to the lectern with a calm that masked steel. He read from the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. He paused. The abbey echoed with breathless stillness. Then, with a measured glance toward the front row, he closed the book and added, not from scripture, but from himself. And in times when silence becomes complicity, one must remember, neutrality is a choice too. It wasn't just a message. It was a line in the sand. After the ceremony, as guests filed out into a grey London afternoon, a journalist approached Sunak for comment. "Do you feel the king overstepped today?" Sunak's reply was stiff. "The crown is a symbol. Government leads." But later, on social media, one image outshone them all: Charles outside the abbey, speaking with a young Commonwealth soldier, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. The caption read, "He may not govern, but he leads." By dusk, Buckingham Palace released one final note. His Majesty stands not above the people, but among them. The crown hadn't asked for this moment. But it had answered it. And for a nation uncertain of its direction, that answer was enough. In a world where silence is often safer than truth, one man in robes chose to speak while others in suits stood still. King Charles didn't seek the spotlight, but when leadership dimmed, his presence burned brighter. This wasn't just a clash between monarch and prime minister, it was a quiet revolution in plain sight. Rishi Sunak may control the levers of power. But in the hearts of many, it was Charles who led. And when history turns to this chapter, it may not ask who ruled, but rather, who stood tall while the ground shook? One thing is certain. The crown did not step aside.